him a lot, 'cause we got him on the spot. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back.
Welcome back to On the Spot. I'm Paula Schuffner with episode 2, Basket Case. The IMDb summary is Kotter is pressured to give Boom Boom a passing grade on his exam, which he fails, so that he can continue to play on the basketball team. Poorly constructed sentence. It should be Kotter is pressured to give Boom Boom a passing grade on his exam so that he can continue to play on the basketball team, but Freddie fails. And it is odd that they are calling him Boom Boom when we have not yet run into that nickname. This episode first aired on September 16th, 1975. Bob Lahendro directed again. This time the writer is Jerry Ross, who was born in 1941 in Toronto. His first writing credit was for Armstrong Circle Theatre in 1961. He usually did an episode or two of a sitcom, as he does here, and that includes That Girl, That's My Mama, Sanford and Son, Barney Miller, What's Happening, Chico and the Man, Archie Bunker's Place, Give Me a Break, Lewis and Clark, which was Gabe Kaplan's 1980s sitcom, Mama's Family, The Cosby Show, and then in 1992 he did The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and Rock. He also did a few dramas. And you'll probably notice among some of those titles that there were several ethnic shows, so Welcome Back Kotter fits in with that. In the cold opening, Gabe brings Julie a soda and joins her on the couch. He calls her honey and says that coming back to the old neighborhood brings back a lot of memories. At this point, we don't know how long they've been married or how long they've been living in the neighborhood, but presumably it's recent since it's welcome back. The memory he tells her about is not a happy memory. When he was about 9 years old, a bully named Tommy O'Shaughnessy would pick on him, so an Irish kid. Julie sympathetically calls him honey and takes his hand, and I notice that that seems to be their pet name for each other. They don't say darling or dear, they say honey. Gabe told his father about Tommy, and his father said that a bully is nothing but a coward, and Gabe should tell Tommy that. So Gabe did, and Tommy got on his bike and rode over to Gabe's house, where he beat up Gabe's father. This joke is not the only reference to Gabe's father, who we will meet in a future episode. With the previous episode, I said that Julie was just in the frame, the cold opening and the tag, but we actually get her in the first scene, which is again at their apartment, and they are sleeping on their fold-out couch. They haven't gone into this yet, but this is basically a small studio apartment. There is no bedroom. The alarm goes off and she turns it off. She asks Gabe if he's awake. He sits up with closed eyes and says he's asleep. The applause for that lasts about 8 seconds. She tells him it's time for school. He says there's a test today and he doesn't want to go to school. Like he's not fully awake and he thinks that's his mom trying to get him to go to school. He lies back down and covers up with a blanket, facing away from her. There's laughter and brief applause. She smiles and leans over him. She calls him honey and reminds him he's a teacher, so he doesn't have to take tests anymore. Just give them. He lowers the blanket and smiles, with his eyes still shut. He says, oh yeah. He gets out of bed, but he groans in pain. She's sitting up, about to get out of bed, but when he gets back in, she puts her arms around him and sympathetically says that he's sore from playing ball yesterday. It doesn't say what kind of ball, but based on what happens later in the episode, I'm going to assume it was basketball, and we don't know if he's just shooting hoops by himself or if he has a local friend that he plays with. He denies that he's sore, and she asks about the noise. He says, what noise? He gets out of bed and makes the noise again. She points, even though he can't see it, so it's just for the benefit of the audience. And she says, that noise. She's never heard him make that noise before, which is another reason why I don't think they've been married that long. I don't mean that in a suggestive way, I'm just saying. He says that that's the noise his father makes when he gets up in the morning, but his father didn't start to make that noise until he was 40. Gabe thinks he's too young to be making his father's noise. And again, we don't know how old he is. He could be 28 or 30. Julie tells him to take a hot bath and calls him honey again. So we haven't seen their bathroom yet, but we do find out they have a bathtub. It's not just a shower. Gabe starts to walk towards the bathroom with his hands bracing his back, repeating himself about his father's noise. Then he realizes this is his father's walk. In the background, we can see the word closet in capital letters painted in white on a brown stripe over their closet door. And that was always one of my favorite details about their apartment. It's just one of those very 70s decorating touches. Scene 2 is in the classroom, and this time the cursive on the board says something about American government. So in this episode, we actually do find out more about what Mr. Kotter teaches. He teaches American history and government. And there's also a hangman game with blank or blank blank. Nobody fills it in. It would have been nice to have a running background joke, but it's just there. It looks like the same 6 extras as last episode, and almost all of them are in jeans, although the taller white girl is in a mid-length skirt. The shorter white girl has ponytails. She and Juan are standing next to Vinny's seat, watching him study for the test. Vinny snaps his fingers and then points at the book with both his hands. The girl turns the page and smiles at him. And I wrote Fonzie-esque, and I'll go into this a little bit more later. Arnold comes in and asks, Vinny, have you seen my... This is an example of how Arnold, I think in particular, tends to call the others by their first names. Juan shushes him and says that Vinny is studying for the test. Freddie comes in miming dribbling a basketball, and he sings a song that might be Sweet Georgia Brown, like the Harlem Globetrotters, but is probably just a random basketball-like tune. He's wearing sunglasses. Everybody looks at him, and Vinny calls him Washington. We can already see how success has gone to Freddie's head. This episode is a little bit like some of the Brady Bunch episodes where somebody gets praised for a hobby and then they get a swelled head and then they get their comeuppance. This doesn't go in that direction exactly, but it did remind me of that. Like Great Brady thinking that he's going to be a baseball star. Freddie thinks that he will be a basketball star. The whole class is happy for him, not just his buddies, but the extras as well. And this is an episode where the class is pretty much united. They are all rooting for Freddie. They're on his side. Vinny appoints himself Freddie's manager. This episode is the beginning of the 2 taller sweat hogs becoming a duo like Juan and Arnold. And there's a reference to the New York Knicks, so local. When Washington does his commercial, Juan and Arnold join in with Juan making clapboard hands and Arnold using a comb as a mic. We get the first of Freddie's "Hi there." That makes sense in the context of the commercial, but when it becomes a catchphrase, he just pretty much drops it in for audience reaction. I don't know if it's racist that he's endorsing fried chicken. Obviously, this is a spin on the KFC slogan, finger licking good. Vinny goes over to Freddie and tells him that he'll be up to his fro in dough. So up to his not very large afro in money. Arnold tells Freddie that groupies will be crawling all over him. This is not something that later Arnold would say as he becomes more innocent, but it kind of fits the early Arnold. Juan says he never thought about groupies, which is surprising because Juan is usually horny. And he says maybe he should try out for the team. Freddie says Juan is too short, so Juan jumps onto the desk on his knees, which is a pretty impressive stunt. And he says he'll lie about his height. And I think he calls Freddie Amos, and I didn't know if that was a reference to a basketball player or like Amos and Andy. I didn't get the context for that. Juan and Freddie high five. Kotter comes in the green jacket from the previous episode, and he guesses that they're the Flying Walendas, which is a still active circus troupe of acrobats that go back over a century. The students return to their seats. Kotter has brought in not only his briefcase, but a little green bucket with a sponge and a spray bottle inside. He says this is because of the exam. He has Juan and Vinny roll up their sleeves, so I guess in the past they're the ones that have cheated. And I'll get into this a little bit. This episode feels like they've all known each other at least a few months. Vinny asks him what for, and Juan says it's against the Constitution. One thing I noticed in this episode, and also the previous one, is that they are not supposed to be very good students, but maybe Kotter's a really good teacher because they make references to American history and government just in conversation. Juan does hold his arms out, and Kotter says that this isn't a democracy. He pushes up Juan's sleeves. He calls him a good boy because he doesn't have writing on his arms, and Juan grins. Vinny has rolled up his right sleeve and says there's nothing on it. Here we get a slightly more advanced version of the still primitive what, where, etc. Vinny routine. I thought it was interesting acting or directing choice for John Travolta to have Vinny not be upset about being caught or accusatory. He actually looks amused and proud of himself that he came up with writing on his arm. The 2 extras behind him are enjoying this, and we see quite a bit of them in this episode because of how they're sitting in relation to Vinny and how much screen time that Vinny gets. I don't think we ever meet or hear about Evelyn again, but I wouldn't guarantee that. Writing names and phone numbers on your hand used to actually be fairly common on TV in real life, but obviously it doesn't happen these days. Kotter sponges down Vinny's left arm, but Vinny has him leave Evelyn's phone number, and I assume Evelyn is not one of the girls in the room. Kotter says that now that the information is in their heads, and only in their heads, he wants Arnold to distribute the exam. There's a weird thing in this episode where sometimes it's a test, and sometimes it's a paper, and sometimes it's an exam. At least it's not a quiz. In general, an exam is bigger and rarer than a test. We'll learn later Kotter is given other exams. That's why I'm thinking that he's been there maybe at least 2 or 3 months. Maybe he does one every month. Arnold heads for the door, and Kotter says he wants the exams distributed here. This is an example of how Arnold is not dumb, he's just literal. And he's not a smartass. He's not doing this just to mess with Kotter like Juan might have done. He's actually pretty obliging about it, and the audience enjoys this. Arnold hands out the papers saying, "Go ahead," which is one of his catchphrases, "take one." As Arnold does the back row, Kotter tells the class to not turn the papers over until he tells them to begin. Juan says Freddie has some great news. Freddie calls him Mr. Kotter, I think for the first time, and says he made the basketball team, first string. Kotter and the class clap. Kotter sits on the edge of his desk and asks what Freddie is going to play. Forward? And Freddie says no, star. So here we get to see some of Freddie's cool moves. He refers to Walt Frazier, who played for the Knicks from 67 to 77, the still very famous Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. 1975 was the year that he switched from the Milwaukee Bucks to the LA Lakers. And of course, the still very famous Muhammad Ali. And we get a not very good, but still recognizable impression by Kotter, which the audience really likes, and you can see Kaplan soaking in the applause. Obviously, as the show goes on, they will play to the studio audience more and more. Freddie grins and calls Kotter Ali, teasing him because he's nothing like Muhammad Ali. He tells him that if you've got it, flaunt it. One points over his shoulder and says, "If you ain't got it, you're Horseshack." Then one laughs. Arnold looks offended, and then he karate chops one's shoulder. One looks puzzled. Arnold looks like he hurt his hand. And I think that would be kind of a running joke or a characterization that Arnold would try to do something brave or physical and more hurt himself. Kotter says he was a pretty fair basketball player when he went to school here, and so a little bit more of his background when he was at Buchanan. Arnold scoffs and does his laugh, and then he covers his face in amusement, so again, starting to build up that aspect of his character. Fred and Juan grin. Kotter asks why that's so hard to believe. Vinny says it's Kotter's body. Kotter says he's in perfect physical condition. Vinny stands and says that's just not a basketball body. He has Freddie stand up and show off his basketball body, so Freddie does some moves, like flexing his muscles. Vinny says that's a body for running and jumping. He says Kotter's body is for sitting and spreading. Freddie laughs. Vinny says basketball for Freddie and basket case for Kotter. Again, a title drop. And basket case is a slang term for somebody with mental illness, I guess you could say. So pretty offensive by modern standards. It is arguable that by the end of the episode, Kotter has been turned into a basket case. He suffers quite a bit. Everybody is amused, especially Freddie. Vinny and Freddie sit down again, and Kotter says enough stalling. They have a test today, and he really hopes they all prepared. That one is wearing a plaid shirt and raggedy overalls just added to my delight when I realized, oh my god, it's a note from Epstein's mother, the first of the series. Although, it is not the first that Kotter got because he says another note, like Epstein has done this before. Kotter says certainly, which is a Curly of the Three Stooges kind of pronunciation. Kotter notices when Juan is mouthing the words to the note, which of course Juan wrote, like all the notes, but Juan keeps mouthing. He's just committed to this. Juan says that he has bursitis. I don't remember every single note. I think it wasn't always an illness or a medical emergency. And yes, the note is signed Epstein's mother. There's no other way to put this. One is wearing a shit-eating grin at the end of it. He's just putting it all out there. He's staking it on this note. And this little scene is an early example of how Kaplan and Hedges play off each other, like when they're both doing head shakes. Although Kaplan had different dynamics with each of the Sweat Hogs. As a kid, I think partly because one was my favorite. I really loved how they played off of each other, and I think it was also that I was a very young Marx Brothers fan, so when they transitioned into doing very conscious Groucho and Chico-like routines, I loved that. So it's nice to get this early on. Juan denies writing the note, and I think he never does quite admit that they are never his mother's words. But then he does admit it to the extent that his mother's bursitis is worse, and so he had to write it for her. Then we get his defeated walk back to his desk with the note. Kotter asks if there are any more notes, excuses, diseases, or religious conflicts, and Vinny fervently shakes his head at all of these. Kotter tells them to turn the papers over. They have 30 minutes. Again, I don't know how long these classes are. Maybe they're 40. We've already spent time talking about Freddie being on the basketball team. He tells them that if they get stuck on one question, forget about it and go on to the next one, which is generally good test-taking advice if you have that option. As the class starts writing, Vinny slyly pulls up the left leg of his jeans, revealing a very hairy leg with writing on it. Kotter says Barbarino. That's one thing I noticed in this episode. He tends to call Vinny Barbarino and Juan Epstein, but he'll say Arnold and Freddie. But I don't know if that's consistent, but that was what I was noticing in this episode. Vinny reacts with, what? And drops his pencil. Then Vinny tries to play it cool, crossing his arms. Kotter tells him to roll up his trouser leg. Vinny smiles and flirtatiously asks, what did you have in mind? The guy behind Vinny is very amused. Vinny claims the writing is a skin condition. Kotter imitates W.C. Fields as a doctor as he applies the cure of the spray bottle and sponge. Then we fade to a close-up of Arnold in the classroom. Kotter is walking between the desks and says there's about a minute left, so we know that it's towards the end of the test. Arnold and Juan are mouthing letters as Arnold helps Juan cheat. And they don't go into why this is happening. We don't know if Juan intimidated Arnold, if this is just Arnold trying to help out a friend. Kotter pulls Arnold's desk back. So Arnold mouths bigger and holds up 5 fingers. Kotter turns Arnold's desk around. And he doesn't punish them. That's the extent of what he does with them. He knows that they're cheating and this is how he deals with it. And maybe that's partly because he's an ex-sweat hog and knows how this goes. Freddie is drawing himself as a character called Super Stilt, and I think that might be a Wilt Chamberlain reference. And the cartoon shows that maybe Freddie should be pursuing art. We find out that Miss Fishback, who was referred to in the previous episode, is the art teacher. And one says that Kotter looks like her only around the moose-stache, which is how he pronounces mustache. I think there's a consistent thing that Miss Fishback is supposed to be homely. Kotter tells the class to leave their tests on his desk. He wants to see Washington. Freddie and Vinny both come over. Vinny asks why Kotter is hassling Freddie, who doesn't have to write that exam. Meanwhile, in the background, Arnold is showing Juan his paper so that Juan can do last-minute cheating off of it. Vinny says Freddie being on the team means he passes. Juan, still copying from Arnold, says it's a fact of life. Fish gotta swim, birds gotta fly. Vinny says varsity athletes gotta pass. It's a Buchanan tradition. Doesn't say in this episode that that's the name of the high school, but we know that from the previous episode. The other students are gone by now, and the 4 main sweat hogs are gathered around Kotter's desk. Arnold and Juan are handying their tests. Kotter says he just loves to break tradition, which is partly his reaction to that, but I think is actually true of him as a character. Freddie says, man, athletes gotta pass or they don't play. And he tells Kotter about a quarterback named Moose Nolan who had to write an essay on his favorite fictional character. So he handed in 7 blank pages. Kotter jokes that maybe his favorite fictional character was the Invisible Man. I don't think I remember this. I just knew that that was what the joke was going to be because I know how Welcome Back Kotter jokes work. One says, but Moose passed. And Vinny adds that it was because Moose was on the team. Vinny says, that's the way it is, Mr. Kotter. So Mr. Kotter says, that's the way it was, Mr. Barbarino. Mr. Kotter says nobody passes in his class unless they earn it. He tells Freddie to come back after his last class and do a makeup test, which I think is pretty nice of him. He didn't have to do that. Freddie says no deal and tells the others, let's go. They leave, Freddie last, and he says he's not coming back. And he says to Kotter, you used to play basketball, didn't you? When Kotter says yes, Freddie says, boy, have you changed. After Freddie closes the door behind him, Kotter tells the empty classroom, and of course the audience, that he hasn't changed. He can still play basketball. He mimes dribbling, then he hurts his back with a hook shot, leading to his father's noise. There's applause and a snippet of the theme song as he sits at his student's desk, and the audience applauds again, and we go to a commercial break. So, although this episode is about Washington, I would argue it's more about Kotter's conflict between his past as a sweat hog and a high school basketball player and his responsibilities as a teacher. When we come back, the next scene is in the faculty lounge. Woodman is there with a man in sneakers, jeans, a blue hoodie, a t-shirt, and a whistle, and this is obviously the coach. The first episode had a lot of guest stars. This one just has Jess Nadelman as the nameless coach. He was born in 1944, but I don't know the location. He had a very short TV career, from the Bob Newhart Show in 75 to Quincy in 78. I most know him for a very different role on Three's Company as a pretentious chef named Michael Winthrop who goes out with Chrissy. Woodman and the coach sit at the table with Gabe. Woodman tells Kotter they're surprised that Kotter would give an unfair test that a boy like Washington couldn't pass. Woodman has the test with him, and he says question number 3 is, when was the Declaration of Independence signed? He thinks this is a trick question. Kotter says it was 1776. Not even the month and day, just 1776. One thing about Welcome Back, Kotter, and I think partly because I was watching it as a little kid from ages 7 to 11, I was very aware of that at the time, that they would slip in very basic historical facts. You could get it pretty early on. And then in the next shot of Woodman, I just suddenly thought, God, he looks like Richard Nixon. Which is interesting because the line he says is he doesn't know if Kotter has noticed, but he's not a happy person. A winning team might make him happier. Not happy, but happier. Coach calls Gabe Ace and punches his arm. He asks where Gabe's school spirit is. And I don't know if he's a former classmate of Gabe's. We don't find out anything about him. I mean, even less than we did about Wells in the previous episode. The coach says that we can't win this season without Washington. Kotter says Freddie Washington is more important to him than a winning basketball season. So I thought it was interesting that he uses Freddie's full name. Kotter thinks it's not going to do Freddie any good by giving him a free ride. He says that Woodman is right. Freddie is a bright kid and he could have passed, but he didn't even try. So this is the second episode in a row where Kotter says that the Sweat Hogs are bright. Annoyed, Kotter says somewhere Freddie got the idea that being on the team is an automatic pass. The coach grins and Woodman stutters, so we know where Freddie got that idea. Woodman thinks that since Kotter thinks Freddie could have passed, Kotter should give Freddie the benefit of the doubt. Coach says Kotter should do it for the team. He calls him Chicky Baby, which is like a Hollywood agent of the 50s or 60s. It was just a very odd nickname, which returns later in the episode. And he playfully punches him on the chin. Woodman adds that Gabe should do it for Buchanan, and the coach stops smiling and adds, for my job. Unlike Kotter, the coach doesn't care about Freddie as a person. He just wants to have a winning team and keep his job as coach. There's a cut to Kotter looking mad. We go back to the classroom. The cursive on the board still says American government, but now includes Washington, Cherry Tree, Delaware, and Boat. And so I wondered if this was just supposed to be a little pun because the episode is about Freddie Washington, and of course these refer to George Washington. It's clearly the same day as the previous scene because Kotter is in the same yellow shirt, now with a tan jacket. And I think from the context, he was in the faculty lounge before school started. Kotter says, as usual, their exams were an amazing experience. Again, I don't know how many exams he's already given them. Then he asks how Washington did. So that's again an example of how the class is united behind Freddie. They're not as concerned about themselves. He is their star. And they don't go into it too much, but I think it's partly that they're sweat hogs and they're seen as failures, and he has a chance to succeed at something and be their representative. It's sports, so it's something that they admire more than academics. Kotter says Freddie didn't pass, but he did make the bulletin board. He hangs up Freddie's test, and we see Super Stilt again. Vinny snaps his fingers, and he and the other students, except Freddie, cross their arms. And I wrote, he's so Fonzie-like in this episode. I don't know if this was a conscious thing. I'll get into this more as we go along. I would say maybe from 76 to 78, there was this sort of odd Fonzie-Barbarino rivalry in like kids magazines and things. Who's cooler kind of thing. At that point in 75, of course, Happy Days was going into into its third season. Fonzie was not as major a character as he would shortly become. I would say 76 more than 75. So I don't know if these are conscious things. And they're both ABC sitcoms, and at that time they were airing back-to-back, of course. Kotter hands back the tests, starting with the taller white girl who is named Dolores. I don't know if they'll be consistent with that. And then Ralph is the white guy with curly hair who sits next to her and behind Vinny. And then Kotter hands Vinny his test. He tells Epstein that he got a 65, actually 63, but Kotter gave him 2 points for working under the influence of bursitis. One gives him the silent treatment, even when Kotter tells him he passed. Kotter says, "Come on, let's hear it for Epstein." The whole class gives him the silent treatment. Kotter wonders if this is All Quiet on the Homeroom Front, which is a reference to the book and movie All Quiet on the Western Front, which was about World War I. That's what I mean about you get these little history factoids and references. Even though Kotter obviously doesn't want the silent treatment, he says that this is a very pleasant change from the usual mouth-to-mouth combat. Actually, in this episode, there is a lot of the Sweat Hogs and Gabe insulting each other back and forth and crossing boundaries in a different way than the previous episode because he treats them as equals and they respond like he's one of their pals. And then, of course, he has to be the teacher at times, and so there's a conflict there. One unfolds his arms and says Kotter knows what's bugging them. If Kotter wants conversation, they'll talk his ear off. And that felt very characteristic that Juan would be the first to break, and he is very verbal. Juan says all Kotter's got to do is pass Freddie. Arnold says yeah. There's not a lot with Arnold in this episode. He is just sort of tagging along and agreeing with the others. Kotter firmly says no. Vinny asks why not. Kotter says it wouldn't be fair to the rest of them. Why should Freddie get special treatment? Juan says because Freddie is special. He's going to be the school's ace basketball player. So that's what I mean about they see him as their star. Kotter says Freddie is no more special than Juan, who's the school's ace menace to society. And that's something I think we see a lot of in season 1, that Juan is the most hoodlum-ish of the group. Not so much now, but more so as we get through season 1. And I think by season 4, they kind of mellowed on that. Kotter doesn't want to talk about this anymore. Vinny smiles and stands. He didn't want to resort to this, but he wants to talk money. Then when Kotter accuses him of offering a bribe, Vinny denies it. Vinny says he's offering a percentage of his own percentage. Again, we see Vinny playing Freddie's manager. Eventually, he does admit it's bribery. Kotter seems a bit amused, and I think it's because he's got this poor student who's offering him a bribe. And of course, Kotter doesn't make much money, but he has more money than Barbarino. We hear that Kotter's wife has an exclusive on his entire body. There will be a few episodes in which Kotter's fidelity will be tested. And I wrote, why are there these weird Kotter/Barbarino moments in this episode? Like earlier when Barbarino asked what Kotter had in mind. The bell rings, and Vinny asks if that's Kotter's final answer. Kotter says sorry. Vinny calls him a crummy businessman. So I thought that was interesting that he is looking at it from the perspective of not that Gabe is disloyal, but that he doesn't understand money. The students file out, looking disappointed. Kotter tells them if they didn't get their test to pick it up, so that's how we get around the fact that he didn't pass out more than 4 or 5 tests. Freddie is still at his own desk, and when they're alone, he asks Kotter what his angle is. Although they've known Kotter for a while, he's still kind of suspicious. Like, he just can't believe that Kotter would do this out of the goodness of his heart, especially a teacher. Kotter says he doesn't have an angle. He thinks Freddie's education is more important than basketball. You can see in the scene that Freddie says man a lot, and he says, I don't need no education, which made me think of Pink Floyd. And there are definitely instances with his character and other characters where their grammar is not good. He says dude, very 70s. Like in the first episode, I think they give Freddie more slang because he's African American. This scene, I think, is Lawrence-Hilton Jacobs' big moment in an episode where it feels like we hear more about him than from him. The episode is supposed to be about him on the basketball team and what happens with his test, but you've got Vinny and other people speaking for him. That is different than if it was a Brady Bunch episode where it would focus more on him and he would speak up more and it would be more about his arc. This scene is also good for the Kotter-Washington dynamic, how they relate to each other. They are still kind of getting to know each other. They're trying to understand each other, but they're not there yet. And we have Kotter borrowing Freddie's sunglasses so that he can imitate one of his old classmates, Joe Franklin, who was the basketball star of his time. When Freddie said he didn't know who Joe Franklin was, it was kind of funny to me because I'm a Californian and I've heard of the New York radio personality Joe Franklin, who lived from 1926 to 2015. So it was kind of an odd name choice. Then we get the twist of this story. It turned out that Joe inherited a chain of laundromats and now he's a millionaire. But he's still stupid. I would say that this episode is more structured than the previous episode where we're just kind of drifting and then we get to the great debate. Here, they set up early on that Gabe played basketball in high school and he was playing it again recently. I wasn't sure if the sniffing chalk dust was a stealth cocaine joke. I could see a 70s writer slipping that in, but I may just be reading too much into that. And I wrote the note, the students are comfortable insulting Kotter and vice versa. You see that here with Freddie calling Kotter condemned. Kotter challenges Freddie to a game at 3:15 today. Freddie agrees and calls him Mr. Kamikaze. So again, a historical reference related to Japanese pilots in World War II who go on suicide missions. So he sees this as Kotter is going to kill himself by playing basketball against Freddie. Freddie wants to play for $20, so again, the money element, and Kotter doesn't want to do that. But they do agree that if Kotter wins, Freddie will take the makeup test. When Freddie wants to have Kotter agree that he'll pass Freddie if Freddie wins, Kotter doesn't want to go along with it, but then he very reluctantly agrees. And I don't know if it's because he thinks maybe he can't beat Freddie at basketball, or he feels like that would be unethical. And then Freddie wants him to put that in writing in case Kotter's heart gives out and he doesn't live through the game. So he's again teasing him that he's going to die. The next scene is set in the faculty lounge again. Coach and Woodman help Kotter in. Woodman is holding the basketball, so I thought that was a nice detail that we know that they must have seen at least part of the basketball game. Kotter is in jeans and a very sweaty sweatshirt. The coach puts Gabe on the couch and Kotter makes his father's noise. When he tells Woodman what this is, Woodman tells the coach that Kotter is delirious. Woodman hopes the school's insurance covers this, and I assume that means Kotter hurting himself playing basketball. The coach calls Kotter Chicky Baby again and says that as the physical education teacher, he's got to give his professional advice, which is, you don't look so hot. There's a cut to Gabe, still stretched out on the couch and looking feverish. Woodman asks what he was trying to prove out there. Kotter says it was just a little friendly basketball game with Freddie, and then he adds, to the death. So he's not going to tell them about the deal he made. But he does say that Freddie is on the team because he's passing him, and Woodman and Coach are very happy. Coach had closed the door earlier, so now someone knocks. Coach lets in Freddie, who's in a red tracksuit unzipped to his chest. Freddie asks if Mr. Kotter is there. Woodman points and says that he's on the couch, lying in state, like he's a dead national figure. Freddie wants to talk to Kotter alone. Woodman says he'd better hurry, because Woodman doesn't think that Kotter has much more time. He throws the ball to Freddie, and he and Coach leave, shutting the door. Freddie sits on the back of the couch and says hi there, but not as much as when he was doing the commercial. Kotter says that the least Freddie could do is sweat. Freddie admits he did sweat. He's ready to take that makeup test if Kotter still wants him to. Kotter says he's no Welsher. Bit of a slur against the Welsh, basically that he's not a cheat. He says Freddie won 20-16, so he passes the test. Freddie points out that Kotter is almost twice his age, old enough to be his, and Kotter cuts in, older cousin. Freddie is, I guess, 16 and Kotter is maybe 27 or 28, so not exactly twice his age, but definitely Kotter is older and not as physically fit, of course. Freddie has been thinking he doesn't have that contract sewn up with the Knicks yet. It's better to have all his bases covered. Kotter says, smart move, Freddie. Freddie stands and says Kotter is something else. He really surprised him. He still plays pretty good. Freddie throws the ball up into the air a little and catches it to punctuate, saying that Kotter's still got it. Kotter says, yeah, I got it, but I can't get it off the couch. So we get them both doing their father's noises and walks, with Freddie's father having a hipper sort of stiff walk. And again, we have Kaplan and Jacobs playing off each other, but it's less serious than earlier, of course. And again, there's a snippet of the theme song as we go to the commercial. Maybe they did this in the first episode, but I didn't notice. And it shows transitions that are different than when we're just doing fade outs and fade ins. And then we go to the tag. Now Not much happens here, but I do like Julie's very 70s fashion sense. He pays her a mild compliment. She walks over to join him at the table, and she asks why he never wears hats. He says that when he was young, he always thought his head was too big for his body. All the kids in school called him Big Head. She's sympathetic. One day he came home from school crying. His mother told him not to pay attention to those mean children. To distract him, she sent him to the store for a watermelon, a dozen eggs, a loaf of bread, and a container of milk. Doesn't say how big a container. He said, "Ma, what am I going to carry that in?" And she said, "Why don't you use your hat?" He smiles a little at the joke. Julie still looks serious, and then as the theme song starts, she gestures that he should go back to grading homework. So it's interesting that both of the jokes that he tells in the beginning and the end are about his childhood, and they involve his parents. This is different than the more typical jokes where it's about friends or family. Here he is the center of these jokes that probably took place before he became a sweat hog. Like I said, this episode is less about Freddie than you would think from the synopsis. Not that he has a minor role, certainly he is more prominent than Arnold Horshack. With each episode, I'm going to pick a head of the class, not necessarily a student, but somebody who I feel was sort of the star of the episode. Not necessarily the biggest role, but the one that had the most impact. And I was surprised, but I went with Vinny because he does a lot of being the spokesman for Freddie. Maybe because he's his manager. He also has some funny stuff with the way he cheats. And it just felt like he was the most memorable sweat hog on this episode. Juan and Arnold do some cute stuff, including with the cheating, but the episode doesn't really need them as such. As I said, there is some good stuff with Freddie, mostly in the second half of the episode. In a way, the episode is really about Gabe and his dilemma and his conflicts. I don't feel that the coach character was necessary other than you kind of need a coach for this plot, but really you could have just had Woodman wanting the team to do well. It would have been nice to have at least a brief scene of the coach telling Freddie that he's a star and they need him and he deserves to pass his test. I mean, something to justify him and more to deal with Freddie's conflict. A lot of what Freddie goes through is happening off screen, getting on the team and making this decision in the end that he respects Kotter for respecting him. He is going to take the test after all. And we assume that he passes. I mean, we don't find out in this episode, but I think there are future episodes where he's on the team. On another kind of sitcom, you might have had some mention in the tag, but of course the tag has very little to do with the episode proper. I also feel like if this had been a different sitcom, or at least this one later on, we would have at least gotten a montage of the basketball game of Kotter versus Washington, not just hear about it afterwards. I mean, it is nice to have the kind of visual humor of how devastated physically Kotter is after the game. It wouldn't have hurt to at least had something. I think if it was a later episode, we would have had Freddie's friends there rooting him on, yet also being impressed by Kotter, and we don't get that. There will be future episodes set on the school grounds. Maybe they just don't have that set yet. They certainly are getting their money's worth out of the faculty lounge, though. I'm giving each of these episodes an F- to A+ grade. The previous episode was a B- because it was pretty good. It was a nice introduction, a little bit shaky, but not bad. This one I'm going with a solid B. Again, not an all-time classic, but I did laugh out loud a few times. I felt that the writing was better. Some of the jokes were more questionable, but overall it worked. And I think that Gabe Kaplan's acting was a little bit better. It, of course, was not as balanced as the first episode, but it was still entertaining and gives a nice example of how the show worked in the early days. Like I said, we are getting more and more of the catchphrases that are not yet used to ad nauseum for some people. I actually enjoy them, but, longtime fan. But it is interesting to see the roots and things starting to come together. And also I appreciated that Julie got a little more to do this week. Next time, I will be discussing the pilot, which was the third episode to air. We'll look at why they might have delayed that and what it would have been like if it had been America's first glimpse of the Sweat Hogs and Kotter. So until then, thank you for listening, and don't get bursitis.
Tease him a lot, 'cause we got him on the spot. Welcome back.